As America entered World War I, it had to quickly mobilize for the war. This section will look at that mobilization effort. In mid-May 1917, a month after the declaration of war, Congress passed the Selective Service Act of 1917, authorizing a national draft. A draft had been debated throughout 1916 as the U.S. had prepared for possible war, but obviously the declaration of war ensured its passage. All males 21 to 30 were required to register. The ages were expanded in August 1918 to be between 18 and 45. By the end of the war, 2.8 million men had been drafted, while another 2 million had volunteered. The draft didn't let people pay for proxies like the Civil War draft had, but it did allow certain exemptions, including those for extreme economic hardship, medical reasons, or conscientious or religious objections. To ensure that the draft did not include those mentally incapable, the military used an early version of what was known as the intelligence quotient test, the IQ test. It's interesting to note that the passage of the Selective Service Act was helped by promising to prohibit alcohol from nearby military bases, a demand of the prohibitionists, then pushing for passage of the 18th Amendment. To get men to register, Secretary of War Newton D. Baker enlisted state and local officials in having a national registration day on June 5, 1917, a nationwide day of patriotism. Only weeks after the declaration of war, Congress passed the first of several wartime loan acts whereby the United States gave their allies, Britain and France, huge credits. The billions that the Allies borrowed from the U.S. during the war would figure prominently in the post-war years. Now that the United States was officially in the war, Congress moved to ensure that its own costs were met. First, Congress passed the War Revenue Act of 1917, greatly surpassing the Revenue Act of 1916. Once again, all income tax rates were raised. Once again, they were raised the most on the wealthiest, for a lot of the same reasons as the year before. The War Revenue Act of 1917 set the maximum individual surtax rate at 63%, increased the estate tax to 25%, and imposed new taxes on luxuries. Despite the fact that the law's provisions placed almost three-fourths of the cost on the wealthiest individuals and corporations, many populist Democrats complained that Congress was letting the rich, who they still argued would gain from the war industries, off easy. The following year, in 1918, Wilson caved into these demands and agreed to sign the War Revenue Act of 1918, which increased the tax obligations of the wealthy, increasing the maximum surtax rate and the excess profit tax rate. In total, the war taxes raised over $10 billion for the war. Of course, to raise money, the United States also sold government bonds, war bonds with interest rates termed Liberty bonds, to appeal to people's patriotism. There were four issuings of Liberty bonds in April 1917, October 1917, April 1918, and September 1918, all paying between 3 and 4.5% interest. A fifth issuing after the war in April 1919, paying 3 3/4%, finished off the Liberty bonds. All total, the Liberty bonds raised in excess of $20 billion. Congress had laid the preliminary groundwork for wartime mobilization by establishing the Council for National Defense in 1916, as mentioned earlier in this lecture. In July 1917, the Council of National Defense created the War Industries Board and gave them the specific task of directing industry. The War Industry Board initially had considerable trouble. During the winter of 1917-1918, snow blocked railroads and there were charges of inefficiency. The Navy and War Departments did not coordinate well with the War Industries Board. In 1918, to solve these problems, Wilson named the Wall Street broker Bernard M. Baruch chairman of the War Industries Board, giving him sweeping new powers. Under Baruch, the War Industry Board quickly became almost like an economic dictator. There was strict control of resources, particularly steel. Baruch's War Industry Board always set targets and deadlines for production and distribution of wartime industrial resources. The Council of National Defense had set initial plans to mobilize agriculture and public opinion, but Congress passed two additional laws which gave the President emergency powers to reorganize government and mobilize America further. The Lever Food and Fuel Control Act of 1917 and the Overman Department Reorganization Act of 1918 gave Wilson considerable executive power to do as he thought fit, and Wilson used this power quickly. Wilson followed with the creation of a number of boards and agencies to guide the American economy and life in a way that people never would have tolerated in peacetime. It represented classic progressivism, or reliance upon experts to make successful reforms. First, the Food Administration was created to ensure that the troops and Europe, and of course, the American people, had enough food. To guide the food program, Wilson picked Herbert Hoover, who'd been director of the Belgian Relief Commission and later, of course, would be a United States president. The Food Administration set prices and quotas to stimulate agricultural production, and it also created its own sub-agencies, such as the United States Grain Corporation and the Sugar Equalization Board. Hoover developed a famous slogan, "Food will win the war, don't waste it." Taking a cue from the British, many Americans planted small victory gardens to supplement the food supply. The biggest problem for the Food Administration was a shortage of wheat. To encourage supply for the Allies, the Food Administration encouraged, quote, "wheatless Wednesdays." To conserve meat, it encouraged, quote, "meatless Mondays." It had such slogans as, quote, "eat beans by all means." To show his support for the national effort, Wilson agreed to graze sheep on the White House lawn. Another creation was the Fuel Administration, which sought to conserve fuel by getting some non-vital plants to close temporarily. It's interesting to note that the Fuel Administration pushed successfully for the implementation of daylight savings time. While daylight savings time was abandoned after the war, it reemerged during the energy crisis of the 1970s and has existed in the United States ever since. Wilson also created the Emergency Fleet Corporation, which technically was a subsidiary of the U.S. Shipping Board, created by the Merchant Marine Act of 1916, which I discussed earlier. To ensure an adequate supply of ships, the Emergency Fleet Corporation was commanded to build ships faster than the German U-boats could sink them. The Emergency Fleet Corporation had real problems with bureaucratic disputes at the outset, but eventually constructed almost 100 shipyards. Overall, however, the Emergency Fleet Corporation was probably better in acquiring ships than building their own. Taking power from the Council of National Defense, Wilson created the United States Railroad Administration. The problem here was both the need for coordination of railroads and also a lack of tracks. The Railroad Administration improved both. It subordinated domestic shipments to war needs, and it spent more than $500 million in expanding and improving track lines. To head the Railroad Administration, Wilson picked a prominent Democrat who had served as his campaign chairman and Secretary of Treasury, William McAdoo of California. McAdoo, who earlier had helped construct a railroad under the Hudson River into Manhattan, proved a strong administrator, especially given the many weather problems the railroads faced. As a progressive president, Wilson had been aware of the needs of organized labor, but as president he worried that a union strike could interrupt the war effort. Refusing both demands to draft labor and simply to let the free market set wages and hours, Wilson wanted to ensure both the gains organized labor had made during the progressive era and to ensure that the military had all that it needed. Accordingly, Wilson established the National War Labor Board as a sort of a supreme court for quick adjudication of all labor controversies. Under the joint chairmanships of the industrial labor lawyer Frank Walsh and the former President William Howard Taft, the National War Labor Board heard over 1,200 cases that affected over 700,000 workers. Lacking any statutory authority, the board simply enforced its decisions under the president's wartime powers. In most ways, workers and organized labor applauded the government intervention, as the National War Labor Board got the hours and wages raised for many workers. This concludes the section on mobilizing for the war in 1917.